So we're going to begin now. So can you hear me well? Yeah. Okay. So welcome to this keynote speaker session. We have today we have a world-class professor invited here. Her name is Patricia Mokhtarian. She's a Clifford and William Greene Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology from the United States. Patricia joined the Georgia Tech in 2013 after 23 years at the University of California, Davis, and 9 years of work in regional planning and consulting in California. Patricia has a PhD from Northwestern University, and she's an associate of the United States National Academies and have been the chair of the International Association of Travel Behavior Research. And this year, she was awarded the IATBR Lifetime Achievement Award. And she's also she's part of the editorial committee of 8 transportation journals. So without further delay, so I give the phone, the microphone to Patricia. Go ahead.
Thank you, and hello. Shall I share my screen again? So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thank you so much to the conference organizers for inviting me. So I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer and point out that the kind of talk I'm giving today is not the usual one that I would give, but Alejandra's invitation specifically suggested that I might do something of a career retrospective. And so I have to admit that I like to think I'm modest enough that I wouldn't have done something so self-centered of my own accord. But once invited explicitly to do so, I found it irresistible to try to reflect a bit on some of the past research that I've done. Of course, the land of travel behavior is very broad and diverse, and so any individual's journey through it is going to be heavily idiosyncratic. So just to explain sort of my philosophies or guiding principles, I've tried in my research to focus on applications, but not neglecting the need to be rigorous in data collection and to use appropriately sophisticated analysis methods. I try to tell my students, don't use fancy methods just because they're fancy, but use them if they're the best way to do something, but don't hesitate to do it a simpler way or a different way if that seems more appropriate. I love doing the conceptual deep dives. So often before designing a new survey, I'll spend a year or more thinking about relationships among the variables that might pertain to the subject. And of course, that gives me a better idea of how to design the survey. And then I have to say I've specialized in attitudinal measurement because even since graduate school, it dawned on me that attitudes are really important influences on behavior, and they're influences that are often lacking from some of our more traditional models. I also try to choose interesting topics, at least topics that are interesting to me. And I seem to be attracted to topics where I wonder whether the conventional wisdom is getting it wrong. So things like information and communication technology will substitute for travel. And densifying the built environment reduces automobile travel, and travel is a derived demand. So these are various subjects that I've investigated, and one overarching finding is that, guess what, the conventional wisdom is generally right, at least to some extent. There's a reason why it's conventional wisdom, and sometimes even mostly right, although by no means always. But there's a lot of nuance and detail that I think can add a lot of useful information. And so I like to think that I've done some of that over the years. Of course, like any tour, there's not enough time to cover even all the major sites necessarily, let alone a lot of detail on the sites that are being covered. But I hope to at least be able to cover these top 3 topics, and unfortunately won't have time to cover some other of my favorite subjects over the years. But we'll start right away because I know I'm always try to say too much in the time allotted. So let's start with teleworking, the first stop on our tour, so to speak. And it's fitting to start with it because I started my academic career with it really in 1990 at UC Davis. Started doing research on teleworking, having already been looking at it with my position at the Southern California Association of Governments before that, a regional planning agency. So after doing some 40 papers on teleworking, I set it aside for some years, but I have to admit it's been fun to see it spring back to life during the pandemic and suddenly become a hot topic again that a lot of people are looking very closely at. But during those 40 journal articles, we figured out a lot of things, or so we thought, about teleworking, at least pre-pandemic. And so here I've given just one slide synopsis of a lot of different findings that seem to have emerged from our previous research. And one prominent feature was how slow teleworking was to be adopted. And there are a lot of reasons for that that boil down to jobs aren't as suitable as you might expect when you look at the details of the job, or especially when you ask whether the manager is willing to let you telework or not. So both of those issues, job suitability and manager willingness, combined to mean that feasibility of teleworking was lower than might have been expected superficially. But we also noticed that not everybody who could telework did so. So the interest in teleworking was not as great as we might have thought. And it was certainly clear from data that not everybody teleworks every day, and many do it only partial days. And so the intensity of teleworking was pretty low, even among those who did it. And then we also observed that there was a lot of turnover or churn with people teleworking for a while and then dropping out of it, maybe coming back to it later, but often not staying with it for very long. We also found relatively little impact on residential location, although that was an area that hasn't been well studied and still needs more study, I would say. But we certainly found, or so we thought, that the net impact of teleworking is to reduce travel. In the meantime, also during all those decades, we saw all kinds of extreme events for which teleworking was promoted. Now, I came up with this typology and it's got 4 dimensions, so it's a little complicated. We don't have to dwell on the details, but suffice to say the dimensions deal with is the location of the extreme event, a building, or the transportation network. Was the event planned or at least foreseen versus unplanned? What was affected, either structures or humans or both? And then was the root cause of the event either natural or human? So inside the matrix are all the kinds of, various kinds, not all of the kinds of extreme events for which I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen, teleworking promoted over the years. Here's just a sample of some of the headlines that I was able to collect from the internet. And, if you look at each of the causes of increased teleworking here, we've got an earthquake in LA, we've got the Olympics in Atlanta, we've got a transit strike in New York City, Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast. And what's interesting looking at these headlines is that if you replace those words, earthquake, Olympics, transit strike, and hurricane, with pandemic, these very same headlines look like today's headlines. And so even, as long ago as 27 years ago, we would see this kind of talk that, nobody can get to work these days for whatever reasons. And so isn't it great that we can work from home? And surely now that we've all discovered how great it is after the extreme event is over, then we'll all keep teleworking. And instead, what we generally found was that we went right back to the way we always did work. So again, after several decades of this, I might be forgiven for kind of being a little skeptical at the start of the pandemic and kind of saying, well, we've seen this movie before and we know how it ends. But of course, there are lots of reasons why it might be different this time. And I think a very nice article by Barrero and colleagues that point out things like, well, the pandemic has caused a lot more people to do it for a lot longer period of time than any of those preceding events could have done. And, in the meantime, because it's persisted for so long, we've acquired new skills, we've invested in new technology, and those investments are going to remain even after the pandemic is over. We also discovered that job suitability is more flexible than we might have thought. For example, 3 years ago, a university professor, it was not considered suitable to teach a class from home. And yet suddenly it became suitable to do so in the middle of the pandemic. On the other hand, at least at Georgia Tech, and I think in many other places, it's no longer considered suitable to do so, since we're all expected to be on campus and teaching in person this semester. So it made me realize that job suitability is a lot more flexible than just the title and even the content of the job per se. Would suggest. It depends heavily on institutional permissiveness, if you will, or lack thereof. But, despite all of these quote unquote advantages that suggest teleworking might persist big time, I still wonder whether the preferences are relatively soft, even though, yes, lots of people say they want to keep doing it. There's pros and cons, and lots of people also recognize the downsides. And at least as importantly, are the managers really going to keep letting it happen? And we certainly already see headlines suggesting that a lot of organizations are expecting employees to come back to the office. And of course, there will be some hybrid arrangements in residual. So it doesn't take a genius to suggest that the post-COVID new normal is going to lie somewhere between where we were before the pandemic and the height of what we did during the pandemic. And of course, the question is where in between. And it points, I think, to a challenge that we all face as scholars who try to be scientific and objective. How do we avoid the extremes, the cynical idea that there's nothing new under the sun, we're going to go right back to the way it was, or the other extreme, oh my goodness, everything's different now and it's all going to be brand new and great and all of that. I have a few suggestions on how to try to avoid those extremes. One is to read broadly, think deeply about the context, and try to get out of your own preconceived ideas by exposing yourself to others. And especially pay attention to history. I think those past few decades still do have something to teach us. And also consider the source of who's making these statements. And especially, again, from my cynical standpoint, when I see the breathless pronouncements that everything will be different now, I ask myself, is it a consultant who makes money trying to look wise and saying that you've got to hire me so to make sure you'll do it right in this brave new world that we're going to be living in? Is it the media who needs to have eyeballs on their stories and therefore is going to focus on what's new and different as opposed to what's the same old thing? So I think we all have to struggle with those two extremes. Here's my own probability distribution on where I think we're going to land post-COVID. The vertical axis is the probability of achieving certain levels of working from home and falling between the low of where we were pre-COVID and the high of where we were at the height of the pandemic. And my guess is, no, we're not going to go all the way back to where we were before, but of course we won't be anywhere near the height either. And my own sense is that we'll be closer to the lower end than to the higher end. And we'll see. Lots of people are currently investigating that very question. One thing I realized in the course of looking at it afresh during the pandemic is that everyone can be right. And by that, I mean, depending on how you position your findings, they can look either very pessimistic or very optimistic. So we, like everybody else, has done a survey of working from home before, during, and after the pandemic. And so what I'm showing you here is the face value comments of our survey, particularly with respect to what they expect to do after the pandemic. And so if we take their stated intentions at face value, in our survey data, we have about 6 to 7% work days that were worked from home before the pandemic, 32 to 38% during the pandemic, and expectations of 20% being worked from home after the pandemic, kind of right in the middle as it happens. So again, if you want to be pessimistic, you can say, oh, look, we've lost half of the gains that we had during the pandemic when things returned to normal. And if you want to be optimistic, you can say, look, the share of work from home days has tripled after COVID compared to what it was before. And again, both of those statements are perfectly true and accurate, but if we can believe the stated intentions of our survey. By the way, we're even, as we speak, in the process of trying to figure out how we might temper those stated intentions. And again, this is my informed judgment that probably people are not going to be able or ultimately willing to telework as much as they think they will. And so we're applying some interesting methods to kind of discount, if you will, what I call irrational exuberance, as has been stated about the stock market from time to time. And once we make some very reasonable adjustments for that over-optimism, we see something more like my probability distribution that I showed you a couple of slides ago, that we might lose as much as 3/4 to 4/5 of the gain we had during the pandemic, but still leaving post-COVID working from home days doubling compared to what they were before the pandemic. So that's definitely not chump change, as we would say, and it's definitely not a return all the way back to status quo ante. So what am I now wondering with respect to teleworking? Quite a few things. First of all, does teleworking actually decrease travel, as we were so sure would be the case, was the case before the pandemic came along? Because several studies recently have suggested that actually it's complementary, that it increases travel instead of decreasing it. And my first reaction when I saw those studies starting to come out was, oh, come on, we know better. How come all those early studies found reductions in teleworking? And then I realized that we have really two kinds of travel diary studies, both of them involving travel diaries, that are collectively kind of giving us different results. And so the early studies tended to be before-after studies. We would administer travel diaries to a group of employees before they started teleworking and afterwards. Small unrepresentative samples focused on teleworking. Uniformly, all those studies found travel reductions due to teleworking. It was a panel study and we saw a drop. But these later studies that are finding complementarity are based on national household travel surveys or regional surveys, large representative samples, not a particular emphasis on teleworking, although they obviously asked some questions that enabled people to identify teleworkers, and cross-sectional data rather than panel data. So I'm like, that's interesting. Could it be that the method is actually contributing to giving us a different result? And in particular, I suspected that maybe these cross-sectional studies are not properly accounting for self-selection into teleworking. By that, I mean that teleworking households differed from even observationally equivalent non-teleworkers even before they started to telework. And if so, maybe that's accounting for the fact that their travel is higher. We can observationally find, and this is typical, that teleworkers live farther from work than non-teleworkers and that they do more work-related travel. But these other items here on the list are more things that we typically don't observe, at least in national household travel surveys, that I think might be contributing or being associated with choosing to telework in the first place, and also leading to greater travel compared to non-teleworkers. So I'm going to skip these next two bullets only because I'm about to show them to you graphically on the next slide. And so I think it'll be better not to get bogged down here. So let's look at the difference between longitudinal and cross-sectional inference. What I'm showing here is some generic travel outcome on the vertical axis, maybe vehicle miles traveled, let's say. And then on the horizontal axis, time, and in particular 0 representing before teleworking and 1 representing after teleworking, with the adoption happening in between. Blue is teleworkers, red are non-teleworkers. And so if we're so fortunate as to have longitudinal data, what we might notice then is a reduction in travel behavior, vehicle miles traveled or whatever, between starting telework, before starting teleworking to afterwards. Whereas if we only have cross-sectional data, we can only look at this one point in time, and we see teleworkers reduce their travel compared to before, but it's still higher than the non-teleworkers. And therefore, if all you have is this, it looks like teleworking increases travel. Again, even after accounting for standard kinds of demographics, but not being able to account for those unobserved characteristics that cause them to have much higher travel to start with. And here's one investigation of that hypothesis, if you will, that my PhD student did. This is an unpublished chapter of his dissertation, but he looked at the UK National Travel Survey data. And if you just look at the observed total annualized miles of commute plus non-work travel, you see, those teleworkers, they're traveling on 3,000 miles a year more than the non-teleworkers. So what's so great about teleworking? But once we controlled for both observed and unobserved differences using Heckman type selection model approaches, then we found, sure enough, actually the counterfactual for teleworkers, if they were not teleworking, was some 1,900 miles higher than what they were observed to do after teleworking. So that was my smoking gun that says, yep, it matters how you do the analysis and whether you account for self-selection properly and so forth. So I'm still wondering that, though. I think we still need more studies to, be more convincing on that point. Those are disaggregate studies. I could comment that at the aggregate level, I had co-authored with my PhD student this aggregate model of impacts of teleworking on vehicle miles traveled nationwide for the US. And we're now in the process of updating that model. For this paper in 2005, our data stopped in, I think, 1999. So 20 years later might be a good idea to see what's new. And in both cases, we're having issues with data limitations and basically finding that the aggregate impact of teleworking on vehicle miles traveled is not significantly different from zero. We're doing a little bit of a dance around that and saying, well, it might still be meaningful, even if it's not significantly different. But, we've got challenges trying to do that with the limited data that we still have. But other questions about teleworking, I'm very interested in the residential relocation issue. Anecdotally, we've heard a lot about that during the pandemic. I'm very interested in the extent to which people really are able to, telework long distances and what that does to their carbon footprint. If they go to, fly to headquarters 2 or 3 times a year, they might be responsible for more carbon than if they drove, a 20-mile round trip every day of the week. So I'd really like to see somebody do a study of residential relocation. Partial day teleworking, also very interesting because it certainly affects peak period traffic. We've seen a lot of upheaval of typical travel patterns during the pandemic. And I think a lot of it's due to partial day teleworking of some kind. But I'm also intrigued by really what's competing policy objectives with respect to teleworking. We want to promote it if indeed it does reduce travel, as I still think it does. But to what extent are we hurting transit when we do that? And again, we've seen those issues arise during the pandemic. And to what extent is it just kind of widening the equity imbalance, giving privileged white-collar information workers one more way to be better off, while those whose jobs don't permit teleworking are left with perhaps lower quality transit service and little flexibility in their schedules. So I think there's a lot of kind of justice issues associated with this as well. But let's move on to the next stop on our tour, and that is broadening the scope from teleworking specifically to information and communication technology more broadly. what are the impacts of ICT collectively, if you will, on travel. And it's actually more complicated than just the one-way direction of ICT impacts on travel. These are two different conceptual diagrams, but similar in some ways. The first one coming from my very first paper in 1990 that looked at, not my very first paper ever, but the first one that looked at relationships between transportation and telecommunications. And the second one is from much later papers done with my PhD student as part of his dissertation. No need, again, to go through the details of these diagrams, but bottom line is everything affects everything. And, so we've got a lot of relationships in all different directions. But, a lot of the literature is focused on this classic typology, focusing on impacts of ICT on travel. So the one direction of ICT influencing travel. And you've seen perhaps in the literature a four-part typology of substitution, which is, teleworking, et cetera, all the tele stuff replacing their in-person counterparts. Complementarity, meaning generating new travel, and we'll talk more about that on later slides. Modification can happen when the trip still occurs, but ICT is influencing something about the trip, maybe the destination or the mode or the route or the time of day. And then it occurred to us that there may be a completely neutral impact. If you think about, most of the electronic communication that you engage in, it may have no impact on travel whatsoever. So this has been kind of a classic typology that's been in use for quite a while. I will say that we've gotten a little more complicated over the years as we thought about relationships more deeply. And so again, I won't dwell on the details of this complex diagram, but notice that we basically have different likelihoods of increasing or reducing travel, starting from the lighter colors increasing travel and the darker colors reducing travel. We'll see individual elements of this diagram in later slides. So again, I'm going to move on quickly in the interest of time here. But here's another case in which everyone can be right. So I'm always surprised when I still find people that say, oh no, it's really about substitution. What do you mean complementarity? We didn't find complementarity. And I think one reason that we keep finding both, or that we keep having this discussion of which is it, substitution or complementarity, is that both of them are happening simultaneously. So I think about the communication pie having three types of pieces, three different ways to communicate: personal travel, enabling me to communicate face-to-face, electronic transmission, which we're all familiar with and doing even as we speak. And by information freight, I mean the physical movement of objects that contain information, whether it be magazines, books, letters, even hardware, hard drives, and that sort of thing. So those are the three ways of communicating. And what can happen is that yes, the travel share, the personal travel share, and the information goods movement share of the communications pie might be decreasing through substitution. But if there's generation happening at the same time, the whole pie might be expanding, and it could be expanding so much that the absolute increase in personal travel that we see from the expansion of the pie might more than outweigh the decrease in share of personal travel that we see. So again, depending on what you're looking at and how you're looking at it, both things can be true. This is the title of a paper I published in 2009. And the answer to the question, if it's such a great replacement for travel, why does congestion keep getting worse, has a number of parts to it. One of the things we pointed out was that not all trips have a desired ICT alternative. There may not be an alternative at all. If there is, it may not be feasible for that particular occasion, even if it's feasible in a general sense. And even if it's feasible, people might not prefer to do that. And also, even more broadly, not all ICT uses replace travel. So as we talked about, most emails and other electronic communications don't have really any impact on travel. So the share or the intersection of activities that can be replaced and are replaced by ICT may be a lot smaller than you would think at first glance. But in addition to that, we also have ICT actually generating travel, as I alluded to briefly earlier. And that can happen several different ways. It can, for example, happen by creating time and money savings. So ICT is enabling the reallocation of time and money to other activities. This ad tells it all. By booking with Hotwire, I saved enough to swing both trips. So that's one major way. Another way is by increasing the productivity and or enjoyment of travel time. So the activities while traveling idea. And so it diminishes the disutility of travel and therefore might make more travel more attractive. It also increases the efficiency of the transportation system. So by increasing the effective capacity, it makes travel cheaper in some generalized sense and therefore more attractive, which can stimulate the demand for more travel. And then, of course, it's contribution to the globalization of both the economy, but also of social interactions. And so both on the personal side and the business side, we see this chain of effects in which ICT enables these various things, which in turn, multiplies, intensifies our travel. And we end up again with more and more travel related to this globalization. Now, let's be fair, ICT can also save travel or substitute for travel. And that brings us to the left half of this diagram here. So yes, we can have direct substitution as we talked about before. And we can also have kind of an indirect effect in which ICT consumes time and money, which otherwise we might have spent on travel. And then we have the extreme events effect, so to speak. ICT becomes more attractive. Substitution in particular becomes more attractive as something happens to prevent travel altogether or to make it more costly or more difficult. And then even the multitasking or activities while traveling that we saw earlier can make shared modes more attractive, which might allow us at least to save vehicle travel, except that if we think about an automated vehicle future, the ability to suddenly have completely hands-free travel might end up generating entirely new travel. So even when it can save travel, it might also increase travel. So what's the net impact of all those interacting mechanisms, if you will? In my book, it's complementarity, and I'm not just saying that out of thin air. Numerous studies, both disaggregate and aggregate, have found that the net impact or the dominant impact has been complementarity. But in a number of those studies, we did find insignificant coefficients reflecting a relationship of ICT on travel. So meaning, no apparent relationship. And that's when I realized that just because you get an insignificant coefficient, meaning an essentially zero impact, might not necessarily mean no impact. It might mean the net outcome of substantial impacts in opposite directions. And that's a very different thing. Why is it different? Well, if a zero or insignificant coefficient is based on the fact that there is no impact of either mechanism, here I've illustrated the travel stimulating mechanism, the travel reducing mechanism, both referring to impacts of ICT on travel. If neither of those are significant, then yeah, a zero is a zero. On the other hand, you might have both mechanisms operating at similar levels and canceling each other out, and that would also give you a zero. And so why is that different? Well, because if one becomes stronger, then a prediction of zero would be way off. Whereas if in fact there is no impact either way, then if one of those stimulations becomes stronger, there'd still be no impact and you'd have a zero prediction being correct. So hopefully you can see that not all insignificant results are created equal. And one message to students and others in the audience is if you get an insignificant coefficient when you were expecting a significant one, think about whether there are effects in opposite directions that are canceling out and whether that might be the reason for it. What I'm now wondering about ICT impacts on travel in general. First of all, how stable are those previous findings? Most of those, both aggregate and disaggregate studies I showed you a couple of slides ago, are 20 years old. And that's a long time in internet years. So we definitely need to replicate the previous studies and ideally apply the various methods that have been used on individual studies in the past to data from the same time range, same set of years, and same geographical locations. Because I'd really love to see whether the relationships for industry inputs and outputs are different than the relationships for consumer expenditures, and how does that compare to structural equation modeling on actual activity or usage metrics of travel and communications. I'm also curious, how can we decompose a net impact? All of these aggregate studies, especially, and even the disaggregate studies, are looking at high level aggregations of dollars spent or miles or whatever, without being able to decompose them into what's this one due to? Is it due to saving time, saving money? Is it due to last minute bargain trips that I'm able to purchase? So how can we decompose some aggregate net impact into various mechanisms generating each of those and assign relative magnitudes to each? We're a long way from being able to do that, but it would be relevant and meaningful if we could. And then we've got another thorny policy issue. If we're going to promote ICT, are we in fact promoting more travel? More ICT certainly has economic and social benefits. Our infrastructure bill that hopefully we're going to pass any day now in the US has a ton of money in it for broadband infrastructure. And Lord knows we need that in remote and more rural areas. But once you have greater ICT capacity, excuse me, my research suggests that we're going to be generating more travel. And what will that do to sustainability? Well, issues about travel and sustainability bring me to the third stop on our tour, and that is the positive utility of travel. As we'll see, it's not always clear that more travel is bad from a sustainability standpoint, but it may not be bad from the standpoint of human flourishing and well-being. So questions like that caused me to go back to the very basics and ask, why do we travel? And the answer is obvious, right? We tell that to all of our students in all of our classes, and all of our textbooks say, everybody knows travel is a derived demand. What does that mean? Well, if you're an economist, it means travel's a disutility. It consumes time and monetary resources, which then we can't use on other goods. And we only travel to get from A to B, not for its own sake. Therefore, obviously, we try to minimize our travel time. So we're going to take the straight road, the highway, instead of the scenic route, because we're trying to minimize travel time and cost. After all, it's just like eating, right? I mean, think about it. Eating's obviously a derived demand. It's a disutility because it consumes time and monetary resources, which we then can't use on other goods. We clearly eat only in order to stay alive, not for its own sake. And therefore, we try to minimize our eating time and eating costs. Except, really, that's not true, is it? Actually, we eat way more food than the minimum required to live, and we often spend way more money than necessary on it. At least under many circumstances, we enjoy it for its own sake. And it's certainly endowed with many symbolic and hedonic functions, as well as the utilitarian one. So once I, thought of that analogy and thought of a lot of other things, I began to see quite a few hints that the demand for travel is not, in fact, purely derived, For one thing, it plays a very strong symbolic role in literature, art, and song. And I chose the Beatles' Ticket to Ride song as one example of that, not only because it's a very good example in its own right, but because it allows me to promote the stellar, unforgettable performance of that very song by the Red Hot Chili Professors at the 2009 International Choice Modeling Conference. You can find it on YouTube, highly recommend it. So lots of travel songs, and I've got a full collection of them, well, a large collection of them, let's put it that way. If you think of more, send them to me. But also thinking about historical explorers and adventurers. Of course, in many cases, they had utilitarian motives, functional motives for their exploration, such as finding riches and grabbing slaves and so forth. But surely there was a lot of curiosity and a lot of adventuresome spirit that led people into the unknown in the past. And then it occurred to me that, well, after all, a whole lot of our leisure time is spent in, guess what, travel activities of various kinds. And so, it can't be all bad if we want to spend our spare time doing things that are in effect traveling. And then finally, late in my career, I decided maybe I should look at the psychology literature on behavior, since I claim to be a travel behavior specialist. So looking at the psychological theory of motivation for performing various activities, we see this very clear distinction between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic being, instrumental, utilitarian, the activity is a means to another end, whereas intrinsic means that I do it for its own sake. And I love this word autotelic, auto meaning self, and telic referring to goal or purpose or end. And so many activities can be either, the same activity could have either an intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. And I began to think, why not travel? Certainly a lot of our travel is extrinsically motivated. That's the derived demand component. But in many cases, we may do it for its own sake. Then I started thinking about products as well as activities. So the products I've listed here happen to be travel-related products, but almost any product you can think of has a functionality, but also a beauty, and at least some examples of various products, right? So some emphasize the functionality more, some emphasize the beauty more, but any given product can have elements of each. And same for activities. So we've already talked about eating, and shopping is another one where the marketing literature finds a hedonic shopper as well as a utilitarian shopper. And so, if these things can be true of lots of other aspects of our lives, I don't see why it can't and shouldn't be true of travel. What are some autotelic motivations to travel? Well, this is what we've come up with so far, and you can see there's a lot. Again, not enough time or really the need to go through each of them in detail, but these are the kinds of things that could be explored further with respect to better understanding of people's desire to travel for its own sake. I want to briefly give a little bit of evidence for a positive utility of travel, and I know I'm getting down to where we want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to try to race through these fairly quickly, but there's a number of empirical studies that, again, provide some evidence for this positive utility of travel. Back in last century, we did a survey, and more than 1,300 San Francisco Bay Area commuters, just asked them right out, how do you like these various types of travel on a 5-point scale from strongly dislike to strongly like. And we saw across the board, we first asked kind of generically, and we distinguished short distance from long distance. I'm only showing you the short distance panel here, but we started with overall short distance travel. So kind of generically, how much do you like short distance travel in the abstract? And some 30% of the respondents either liked or strongly liked it. And variations across mode and purpose, as you would imagine, but even commuting, supposedly stereotypically terrible, was liked or strongly liked by some 20% of the sample. The French National Travel Survey, I was excited to realize that they asked a bunch of questions about randomly selected trips. So this is a large sample that's as close to a nationally representative sample as we've seen so far. And they asked, was the trip pleasant, unpleasant, or in between? And again, overall, across all 13,000 of these trips, some 45 or more % rated the trip as pleasant. Now, that's not the same as saying I'm doing it for its own sake. I might be doing the trip because I have to, but still find it pleasant. But neither does it suggest that people are all that inclined to shorten their travel or eliminate their travel necessarily. And then a number of studies have asked about ideal commute time. If you could choose your commute time, what would it be? And found results ranging from 10 to 30 minutes across a number of geographic areas and time periods and so forth. And then we've had occasion to visit that question again during the pandemic when so many people were forced not to commute. Then it's logical to ask the question, how much do you miss your commute? And this is, of course, a study that Alejandro and no doubt others of you on the call are involved in, and found, scale from 1 to 5 that we're not at 1, so everybody on average misses their commute to some extent, and more so for some modes than others, and depending on how often the mode is used. But still, we see some level of missing the commute. And here's another study with an international sample, largely Europe, and asked with a 3-point scale, do you miss commuting a lot, miss some aspects, do not miss it at all? And again, even for car, some 45% or so of the sample, it missed at least some aspects of commuting, and more so for the other modes. So again, it seems that commuting might be fulfilling something for us that we feel deprived of when we don't have it. A model of trip generation found that those with adventure seeking, higher levels of adventure seeking traveled more, so I won't dwell on that one. And then the teleportation test is pretty interesting. If you could snap your fingers and instantaneously teleport yourself, would you do so? So that's deliberately designed to separate out the utility of being at the destination. If you could just get there without having to travel, would you? Versus the utility of the trip itself. And if you say, no, I wouldn't instantaneously teleport myself, then the travel has some meaning or value to you. So we see across, again, a number of studies in geographic areas, a fifth to 2/5 of respondents saying, no, I wouldn't teleport myself. And it's often situation specific, right? If I'm in a hurry or running late, yes, I want to teleport myself. But not always, even on a trip to work, not necessarily. So I'll say that, yeah, probably not a whole lot of trips are purely autotelic, but I think a lot of travel fulfills both instrumental and autotelic functions, just as the same meal can be both utilitarian and hedonic. So it makes it difficult to capture, how much travel for its own sake really is going on. But I think it's worth trying, and just briefly racing through these slides about what I'm still wondering. I think we could do a lot fairly simply with travel and activity diaries, adding one more trip purpose to see how often a trip is made just because I wanted to. We never really know that from the purposes we include right now. And then I like the French idea of randomly selecting a set of activities and just asking a series of questions about that will enable us to determine whether the trip was as short as it could have been, to the nearest destination that would have been satisfactory, the quickest route, and would you have teleported? About positive utility of travel in general, I'm curious, what's the distribution of all those various motivations I showed on the slide I went over quickly across the population? We don't really know. How do they differ by individual characteristics? How much do we really need to travel for its own sake, and can we fulfill that need in ways besides hopping in a personal automobile? And again, this policy conundrum, if you will, how do we balance the benefits of travel against the cost to society? And if we talk about pricing, we're going to be pricing lower income people out of the ability to achieve the benefits of travel. And lastly, on this about modeling the positive utility of travel, how do we get the benefits of travel out of the epsilon and into the V, I think is a non-trivial question. and lots of issues to think about there. But I think I need to close, and 2 slides to close with. I have to say, for you students and young career professionals in the audience, I'm really jealous, because I sincerely believe there's never been a more exciting time to be a travel behavior researcher. We've got all these grand challenge motivations. We've got, fancy new technologies and services to study. We've got data collection tools that have gotten better and more interesting over the years. And our statistical analysis tools have never been more sophisticated and exciting. So really fantastic opportunities here. My own journey has been very exciting. It's still going on, I hasten to say, so I'm not wrapping up my journey yet, but I will say that the more we learn, the more we realize we need to know. And I'm really looking forward to continuing that journey, and with all of you as well. So I will stop here. We still have a little bit of time for questions. And I have 5 slides of references after this. So if anybody wants to follow up on them.
Okay, so thank you very much, Patricia, for your presentation. So I invite the audience to send the questions through the chat. They can also do it through the YouTube platform. So I will ask one question from the audience, from Rodrigo Fernandez. It was related to the whole presentation, to all the topics that you mentioned. So Rodrigo says the reduction in travel doesn't necessarily imply a reduction in traffic congestion. Have you some numbers on what, say, an X reduction in travel means in traffic congestion? Do you have some measure of that, idea of that relation?
Well, offhand, I'd point to the Bureau of Public Roads formula, that's got the nonlinear relationship to volume to capacity ratio. And yeah, it is true that taking off a small slice of travel at the top can have a disproportionately beneficial impact on congestion. Personally, I'm dubious that we'll solve congestion, certainly not with teleworking, would be my guess, because there's that triple convergence idea of Anthony Downs, that if you release some new capacity, if you will, on the system, then you'll have people changing modes, changing routes, changing departure times to kind of take advantage of that new capacity and end up just as congested as before, with a better overall benefit, if you will, with people better able to sort themselves into their desired modes, routes, and times. But as far as reducing congestion, that's a tall order, since it's been with us since at least Roman times.
Okay, so also another question from Ricardo Urtubia. Many thanks for your presentation. Are you currently aware of any trend in residential relocation due to telecommuting and COVID? How long do you think we should wait in order to measure this?
Yeah, that's a great question, because residential locations take place over a longer time frame, and so it is difficult. I almost think you could probably get a good sense of it within a year or two and ask retrospectively, have you moved? And if so, what's the role of teleworking in the decision to move? It's not too soon to start now. One of the issues, though, is that there was probably, at least in my understanding, a fair amount of temporary relocations during the pandemic. So certainly in the university environment, a lot of students went home to live with their parents instead of living in the dorm. Others went to live with other family members or friends or whatever. International students didn't come to the US when they would have, but stayed in their home country and took classes remotely. So, I think there's that short-term issue, which is different from what are they going to do permanently. But anecdotally, we see already, yes, there's this exodus to the suburbs and beyond, and the great resignation, meaning that so many people have quit their jobs on the assumption that they'll be able to get another one. Maybe they already have, that allows more flexibility. So again, not too soon to already start, but I think those effects will be taking place over still several years to come. So I think there'll be fruitful opportunities to study it still in the near to medium term. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Ricardo, yeah. So we have time for, we have another question here. We have a few minutes from Sebastián Siriani, also here. It says, when you're evaluating a new project, you need to include the benefits, typically or mainly the reduction in travel time. How we can still include benefit if people are not needing to move from their home due to teleworking? In an extreme situation, do we still need to build a metro line? In the future, do we need to redesign cities to have more mixed uses? Cities with the 15 minutes idea? What's your insights on that?
Yeah, another great question, and one that really I think becomes very important, since we are used to evaluating projects on the basis of travel time savings. You know, it's a complicated question, and I don't really know the complete answer to that yet, but some parts of the answer are, I think most people, even if they have a positive utility of travel in some context, probably don't have a positive utility of sitting in congestion. And so, travel improvements, transportation infrastructure improvements that do help ameliorate or reduce congestion, even if only temporarily, can be beneficial. I vote for transit on principle, so I think we need transit for people who either can't afford cars or can't drive or choose not to, don't want to, and obviously for its sustainability benefits. So I think we still need to somehow keep transit and keep it viable. But I also think we don't really quite have a good handle on how to monetize, if you will, the positive utility of travel yet. So I tried to sketch in my few slides on research ideas, some ways forward, but I think we have a long way to go before we can be confident enough of what a benefit of traveling is, and in particular how to monetize it. It does suggest giving more emphasis to slow modes, which all the evidence suggests promotes well-being more so than cars and even buses and so forth. So yeah, I think our evaluation system needs an overhaul. I don't yet have tidy answers for exactly what to do, but I strongly think we should be working on it.
Thank you very much, Patricia. One last question from Alejandro Tirecini, also regarding the evaluation. He says, if several people enjoy, say, urban cycling, how should we socially assess the value of cycleways? Could we consider fun of cycling in traditional cost-benefit analysis, or do you think that another framework altogether is necessary?
Right. Yeah, and so maybe another framework. I have to admit, I'm not a cost-benefit specialist, but I think that you have the right idea of somehow trying to evaluate the fun aspect, and in principle for any kind of trip. So much as the environmental economist may talk about the benefit of a campsite or a recreational facility or whatever. So maybe a willingness to pay of some kind. I think there are things we can learn from economists about how to value the benefits as well as the cost, but that's exactly what we need, is some way to put I presume, a monetary value, although to me, not everything can be easily monetized, but what is the value of the human flourishing aspect, the well-being aspect, the physical activity, and as well as mental well-being that we get from various forms of travel, certainly cycling and pedestrian activity, but also for some people, it may be the car, and for others, transit, and for some, the same, different things at different times.
Okay, so thank you very much, Patricia. So because of the time, that will be the last question I can make. So if anybody has another question, can send it to us and we can forward them to Patricia if needed. As I will have to add, I didn't have the time for my question, but I just wanted to add that as a travel behavior research myself, yeah, I agree with your last slide or second last slide about the exciting times that are this. So we now, I agree, we have, new type of data, new type of events, new methods that are coming out. So the chip is moving. So yeah, we have many things. We have to relearn many things. It's we have a lot of fun. So thank you very much again, Patricia. So we're going to close now. But before closing, I'm going to make an announcement, a small announcement. Let me see. I will share my screen. So can you see my screen? Yeah. So even though the conference is fully online, a group of very motivated professors are organizing an informal meeting today at the roof at 7:30. So it is very informal. This is the address. I'm going to send you an email of that. So if you want to show up, we'll be happy to go there and just share a beer or something, so we can have some physical connection today. So that's it. Thank you very much again, Patricia, and thank you very much to everybody for coming, and see you later in the other sessions that